Now I'd like to talk about different theoretical perspectives on biological diversity. And I'd like to talk about 6 different perspectives relating to ecosystem theory, predation and keystone species theory, island biogeography theory, metapopulation dynamics, source sink theory, and intermediate disturbance theory. Ecosystem theory, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with trophic level interaction, transferring energy, materials, and nutrients that connect spheres of influence to create ecological process. As I mentioned before, the question that we have to answer in the context of landscape planning is, how do our designs and plans affect key landscape flows? Again, in a ecosystem with different interactions and patterns of flow, when one of those flow patterns is removed, how does that affect biological diversity in the landscape? Predation and keystone species theory suggests that certain species or guilds of species are critical to sustaining biological diversity. For example, in this image on the lower left-hand side, the northern harrier, this large bird, is the keystone species that regulates species dynamics via food chain relationships. In other words, what does the northern harrier feed upon, and what do the things that the harrier feed upon, and how do our designs affect the viability of habitat for the keystone species? In this particular ecosystem, the northern harrier is quite critical for regulating species dynamics in terms of controlling food chain relationships. Species diversity and abundance is dependent upon interaction between size and isolation of islands or habitat patches. So our concern here is, how do designs and plans affect habitat size and fragmentation? This concept of island biogeography theory suggests that for any particular ecosystem, the number of species that are present in the ecosystem is going to be a function of ecological forces leading to immigration of new species and extinction of existing species. So we're concerned about those forces that lead to immigration, that produce higher numbers of species, those forces that lead toward extinction, reducing the number of species. And so at any point in time, then, there is an equilibrium between immigration of new species and extinction of existing species that is reflected in the number of species that are present in the landscape. We can see that as island size increases or patch size increases, number of species goes up. In the upper left diagram, we can see area of island in square miles, and we can see the number of species that are present. And as the area of a patch or the area of an island increases in size, the number of species goes up. However, there's an interaction effect between size of patch and distance of patch. And so where we have near islands relative to a given island, those islands generally reflect the uniform relationship between patch size and number of species. However, when we get into islands that are further removed, greater distances apart, the rate of increase in diversity declines. So we have rapid increases in species with initial increase in island size, this point on the curve. And as size increases, its effect on diversity decreases. Metapopulation dynamics theory is an extension of island biogeography theory to population size and proximity. This holds that larger populations that are in closer proximity are less likely to become extinct and maintain greater genetic diversity. So the question then that we're concerned about is, how do our designs affect the ability of species to move among different population patches? We can talk about movement within a metapopulation, movement of individual species within a metapopulation, movement of species among metapopulations, movement of species between one population and another population, and movement of species between one ecosystem and another ecosystem within a larger landscape framework. So these various sources of diversity then, the metapopulation, the population, the ecosystem, dramatically affect the level of biological diversity within the overall landscape. Source-sink theory suggests that source patches are characterized by reproductive rates that exceed mortality rates. Sink patches are characterized by reproductive rates that are lower than mortality rates. So the critical factor here then is trying to protect and maintain, sustain the source patches, and so we ask the question, how do our plans and designs affect the viability of source patches? In order to know that, we need to know what the source patches are, which is going to be a function then of size and proximity to other patches. The intermediate disturbance theory suggests that in the absence of disturbance, the presence of disturbance tends to increase diversity. For example, after a forest fire, the diversity of species that will move into a burned landscape is significantly higher than the diversity that was likely present before the disturbance occurred, attributable to fire. Over time, superior species outcompete others and diversity declines. Few species are able to tolerate the extreme frequent and extremely intense disturbances, so diversity declines over time. So the question then is, how do our designs affect historic patterns of disturbance regimes? Intermediate disturbance theory suggests the idea that this intermediate level of disturbance, this point here on the curve, is where we're going to find the highest level of biological diversity. So in those landscapes where we have an intermediate level of disturbance, we're going to find a higher level of biological diversity. That's reflected in Minnesota and Wisconsin by a transition zone between the forested landscape of northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin and what was the prairie landscape of southwestern central Minnesota and southwestern Wisconsin. So it's in this transition zone where the prairie met the forest landscape that we had the highest level of biological diversity. And that's evident in this map that shows ecosystems in the Minnesota landscape. We can see this swath of greater diversity of colors working down through the tension zone between what was the prairie landscape in southwestern and western Minnesota and the forested landscape of eastern and northern Minnesota. Cross-scalar definitions mean that we can look at an individual wetland and we can look at complexes of individual wetlands. So we can move from the scale of the single wetland to the scale of multiple wetlands. We can move from the scale of multiple wetlands to that complex of multiple wetlands within the larger landscape matrix. And then we can look at the integration of that larger landscape matrix into continental biomes. So we can look at exactly the same ecosystem across geographic scale and come up with quite variable insights about factors affecting biological diversity.